All right, we have our list of items, we have our button. We can click on our button and see something happen. So the first thing we notice here is that our list of items is looking, well, not so great. I think we could improve the styling a little bit. So we're going to borrow from some styling out of the box from Bootstrap. All we have to do is go into our dropdown, find our UL, and we'll add the class name dropdown menu. I'll save, make sure that gulp is running. It is. Refresh the page. And all right, well, looks like we somehow lost our menu of items here. If we look at our elements in the element browser over here, you can see that our UL actually still exists, and it does have LIs inside of it. So adding the class dropdown menu actually caused the list of items to disappear. And you'll see it's because we have this property display none. So in order to get our list of items to show properly, we have to add a class on here of just show. So I'll add the class show, I'll save it, we'll refresh the page, and sure enough, hey, here's our list of items, and it actually looks pretty nice here. So it looks like our strategy for showing or hiding the list of items here is going to be adding and removing the class show. Fantastic. So much earlier in the section, we discussed the concept of state. Remember, state is an object that is accessible via this.state on every class. State is used to record user interactions. In our case, we're going to use state to decide whether or not the dropdown should be open. So if state says that the dropdown should be open, we're going to add the class show on here. And if it says that the dropdown should be closed, we're going to remove the class show. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a function in here that's going to initialize our state the first time that this component gets rendered. So we'll add a function, and it's going to be called get initial state. Now again, this is a function that gets ran exactly once, just the first time that this component gets rendered. And whatever we return from this function is what the state will initially be set to. So we'll say return an object that says open false. And what this means to us is, should the dropdown be open when the dropdown first renders? False, it should not. All right. So now that we know how we're going to set the visibility of the list on here, let's add this class in here conditionally using state. So down here on my UL class name, I'm going to turn this into an expression by adding curly braces. So now whatever string gets returned inside of these curly braces here is what the class name will be set to. So we'll say drop down menu, and I'll add a space right after inside of the string. And I want to add on, depending on what initial state is, or what my state is, the additional class of show. So I'll say inside parentheses, this.state.open, and I'll do a space, a question mark, another space, show, then a colon, and then an empty string, like so. So if you're not familiar with them, this is what's called a ternary expression inside of JavaScript right here. So if this first argument is truthy, it'll return the first thing after the question mark. If this is falsy, it'll return the second thing. So you can imagine that if my state, this.state is open, is true, so if we should be open, if the dropdown should be visible, it'll return the class show. If it shouldn't be visible, it'll return an empty string, so it just won't get an additional class at all. And then what that means is the UL will have only the class dropdown menu, and so the dropdown won't be visible. So let's save this and refresh our page. And sure enough, the dropdown's not visible. So let's test how the initial state works by flipping it to true. And so I would do this if I want my dropdown to start off being opened. So just to walk through the code path here, the first time that my component renders itself, it's going to run get initial state, which returns my initial state of open true. I then render my component, and since this .state.open is true, I get the class show, and this class show right here causes the dropdown to be visible. So I'm going to save this, flip over, and refresh the page, and sure enough, now my dropdown starts off as being visible. Great. If you're having any difficulty with this, make sure that you have a space after the class dropdown menu. You should be able to, inside of the elements pane over here, you can just right click on the button, say inspect view, and then we should see the UL with the class dropdown menu space show. All right, so now we're going to go to step 2. We can make our dropdown be visible or open or closed when the components first ran, but we want to be able to react to a click on the button to toggle the visibility of the dropdown. So I'm going to say that I'm going to flip this true back to false, which means that our dropdown is going to start off as being closed. And then we're going to think about how we're going to react to clicking on that button. Well, we've already got this click handler right here. So really all we have to do is change our state from open being falsy to truthy, and then force our component to re-render itself. And that second part is really important. Just because I have a click handler somewhere in here that says that I'm going to flip the visibility of the, or that I want to open the state, I want to set this .state.open to be true. I want it to be open. Just because I set that to true doesn't necessarily mean that this component is going to get re-rendered. So there's a very special method that we're going to use to interact with changing this state. So inside of handle click, I'm going to remove the alert code. And whenever someone clicks on this, I want to flip the current value of state. So if it's currently true, I want it to be false. And if it's false, I want it to be true. So I'm going to start off by saying this .set state, and I'm going to pass it what the new state should be. So I'll say open should be the opposite of this .state.open. All right. So this .state.open says, look at the current state of the dropdown. Is it currently open? I have the exclamation mark in here to say whatever it currently is, reverse it. And then we're going to change our state to be open, the reverse of whether or not it's open or closed right now. And then we're going to manipulate our state object by using this method here, a React method called setState. Now this setState right here is a very important method that we make sure that we use. SetState is what's going to not only change the current value of our state, but also force our component to re-render. So remember, it's not enough just to change state from open to, between true or false. We also have to make sure the component re-renders itself. And that's what setState does for us. One pattern that you should never ever see inside of React is something that looks like this. We never want to directly manipulate our state object. We should always be making changes to it via setState. And again, we use setState by just passing it the object of what we want state to now be. Okay. So now that we have our click handler in place here, let's check gulp, make sure we don't have any errors. We don't. Fantastic. So let's refresh the page. And I'll click, and it opens, and I click, and it closes. Awesome. So this is state in action. When a user interacts with your component, we're going to change the state of the component to make it appear to be something different. You might ask yourself, What is the difference between using state and props? Why can't I just say, use props to do this? And that is an excellent question that we'll be looking at in great detail in a coming section. But for now, always keep the rule of thumb. Whenever we want to be responding to some type of user input, we want to be thinking about using state. Whenever we think about the data that we're trying to show, we want to be thinking about using props. All right. There's just one last problem that on this component that we want to fix up. Whenever we click on an item, nothing actually happens. It doesn't close the dropdown and it doesn't select the item in any meaningful way. So in the next section, we're going to wrap up this component by implementing that behavior.